On a July afternoon in 2008, in a boardroom in St. Louis, an American company board voted to hand a beer company to a Belgian conglomerate for $52 billion. The name over the door had been the same for 150 years. The name of the man in the chief executive's chair at that moment was August Busch IV, and he had not been the last of them. He had been the sixth. 5 generations before him, a German immigrant had built the brewery, buried under a Gothic tomb marked in Latin, "I came, I saw, I conquered." Between the tomb and the vote, a father shot himself with a pearl-handled revolver in a mansion. A daughter of 8 was killed on the road home from school. A son forced his father out of the company, and a young woman was found dead in the last Bush's bed. This is the family the Latin over the door was written for, and this is what the family did to itself. If you like a Gilded Age story told from the private side of the mansion, subscribe to Cursed Fortunes. I make long documentaries about the families the fortune ate, and this one is the largest single consumer brand fortune America ever produced. Chapter 1. The Tomb on the Highest Hill. On the highest hill of the oldest cemetery in St. Louis stands a Gothic mausoleum built from 2 foot blocks of granite, and above its door 3 words in Latin promise the visitor everything. The cemetery is Bellefontaine, laid out in the middle of the 19th century on land that then lay north of the city proper, on ground that rose in a soft ridge above the Mississippi. In the years after the city outgrew the small church graveyards downtown, the rich families of St. Louis moved their dead north to Bellefontaine, and by the last quarter of the 19th century, almost every founding fortune of the American Middle West had bought a family plot along its long tree-lined alleys. The Anheusers are here, the Buschs are here, the Chouteaus and the Lemps and the Lambs and the Blairs. The place is a directory in stone of the businesses that built the town, and on the highest of those ridges, at the head of the longest and greatest of the alleys of oak and elm, stands the tomb the family built for its founder. It was designed by a St. Louis architect named Thomas P. Barnett in the years after 1913, in a Gothic revival style that owes its bones to the medieval chapels of northern France. It is made of solid 2-foot blocks of grey granite, quarried in the American Middle West and cut on site. It rests on a plinth of the same stone. The door is bronze, cast heavy, and the whole structure sits in the light of the highest ground in the cemetery, as though it has always been there. Small carved figures stand in niches above the door. The roof, in the manner of the Gothic revival, rises to a stone peak, and a single stone finial crowns it. Above the door itself, in raised letters cut into the stone lintel, are the 3 Latin words the founder chose for himself: Veni, vidi, vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. The words are Caesar's, from the year 47 before the Christian era, reporting a victory over the King of Pontus to the Senate in Rome. Adolphus Busch, the German immigrant who built Anheuser-Busch into the first genuinely national brewery in the United States, borrowed them for the door of his tomb. They are, above all, a claim. They say that the man buried here came to a country, saw what could be built in it, and built it. They say the account is closed. They say the man beneath the granite lies down with nothing owed. They are the shortest boast in the Latin language, and the widow who commissioned the tomb, 3 months after her husband died in a German villa on the eve of a world war, meant them as an epitaph the American Middle West would not forget. The tomb was completed in the years after 1913 and stood, from the day of its completion, as the highest single monument in Bellefontaine Cemetery. It still does. 6 chief executives of Anheuser-Busch would come from this family, over 150 years of continuous rule. The founder in the tomb was the first. His son, August Anheuser-Busch Sr., was the second. A grandson named Adolphus, the third. Another grandson, August Jr., called Gussie by the family and by the country, was the fourth. His son, August the third, was the fifth. And his grandson, August the fourth, was the sixth and the last. 6 men, 5 generations, one long straight line down from the tomb on the hill. The line does not run straight for long. It bends. Each generation on this list, without exception, produced a private event the family could not talk its way past. A patriarch who killed himself in his own bedroom. A president who died at 55 in the middle of his term. A little girl killed on the road home from school. A son who forced his own father out of the company at a vote. A brother who shot and killed a friend on a bed. A grandson who walked away from a wrecked car with a dead young woman in the passenger seat and was never charged. A former chief executive whose girlfriend was found dead in his mansion on a December morning of an accidental overdose of a painkiller. Every one of those events is a matter of documented public record. Every one of them can be dated to the day. Every one of them, in isolation, has a grounded explanation. The pain in 1934 had no adequate medicine. The car crash of 1974 was a car crash. The vote of 1975 was a fiduciary maneuver inside a public company. The overdose of 2010 was accidental. Each event has its explanation. The pattern is what has no easy explanation. The pattern is that they all happened in the same family, in 5 straight generations, in and around the same 2 properties, and that the family had, above the door of the founder's tomb, engraved the boldest claim on a settled account any of the great American immigrant families had ever made in stone. The tomb on the hill is the promise the founder made for his family. This film is the accounting the family kept, in private, of what happened after. Chapter 2. The German Immigrant Who Built an American Brand. The 21st and last son of a Rhineland family sailed for America at 18 with an inheritance in his pocket and married the brewer's daughter within 4 years of stepping off the boat. He was born Adolphus Busch on the 10th of July, 1839, in Kastel, a district of Mainz in the Grand Duchy of Hesse. Kastel then lay on the north bank of the Rhine, opposite the great cathedral city of Mainz, across the water. The Busches were prosperous. His father owned a wholesale business in winery and brewery supplies, sourcing hops and barley and cooperage and equipment for the small breweries and vineyards of the Rhineland Valley, and the household had, by the strange arithmetic of the German upper middle class of that generation, 21 sons in his generation. Adolphus was the youngest of them. He was educated at the Collegiate Institute of Belgium in Brussels, where he was taught the classical trade of a Rhineland businessman's son, French and English, and some Latin, and the double entry book. In 1857, at 18 years of age, with an inheritance from his mother in his pocket, he took ship for the United States and settled in the great German immigrant city of the American Middle West, St. Louis on the Mississippi. He set himself up as a brewery supply merchant in the trade his father had run in the Rhineland. He learned the tastes and the trade methods of the German brewers of the American Middle West, who at the middle of the 19th century were still small independent operators, each one supplying a saloon trade in his own city and half a day's carriage ride around it. And he did what the young immigrant men of that generation so often did. He married into the business. In 1861, at 22 years of age, he married Lily Anheuser, one of the 3 daughters of a St. Louis soap and candle manufacturer named Eberhard Anheuser, who had recently taken over a small, failing brewery on the wrong side of the river from a bankrupt operator named Georg Schneider. It was a double wedding. On the same day, his older brother Ulrich married Lily's older sister Anna. The two families were bound in one afternoon in the German immigrant Lutheran church of the neighborhood, and Adolphus took his wife back to a small rented house near the river. Adolphus went into business with his father-in-law in 1865, in the closing months of the American Civil War, in a St. Louis full of returning soldiers and full of an economy about to change. In 1873, at 34 years of age, he became a full partner. When Eberhard Anheuser died in 1880, the company was reorganized as the Anheuser-Busch Brewing Association, with Adolphus as president. The name of the father-in-law went first on the door. But the house was Adolphus's, and everyone from the head brewer to the delivery driver knew it. He was, by every account of everyone who worked for him, the driver. He was the salesman. He was the traveler. He was the man with the accent and the gold-headed cane and the private railway car and the trimmed pointed beard of the great German immigrant industrialists of the American 19th century. Eberhard Anheuser was the sober German bookkeeper. Adolphus was the immigrant who had come to America believing that a great fortune was waiting for whoever could master the science of a small industrial revolution then quietly happening inside beer. The revolution had two names. One was pasteurization. The other was refrigeration. Beer in the American 1860s spoiled quickly. It was, chemically, a live thing, and the wild yeasts and bacteria in the atmosphere of a 19th century saloon or a wooden barrel would turn a keg to vinegar in a matter of weeks. A brewer sold to the town he stood in, and to the town's half a day's carriage ride from him, and to nowhere further, because beyond that distance the beer would sour before it could be drunk. Adolphus Busch, in the 1870s, was among the first American brewers to adapt the new French technique the chemist Louis Pasteur had recently published, gently heating the finished beer just enough to arrest the yeasts and bacteria without cooking the flavor. By the end of that decade, Anheuser-Busch beer could be sealed in bottles and shipped long distances without spoiling. He built his own network of refrigerated railway cars, cold rooms on wheels with insulated walls and iceboxes at each end, and put those cars on every rail line the company could contract with, so that Anheuser-Busch beer could reach any American city with a railhead in 24 to 72 hours, cold, bright, and drinkable. And in 1876, in partnership with a St. Louis restaurateur named Carl Conrad, he launched a light pale mass market lager, made to travel, brewed to a recipe adapted from the small town of Budweiser in the Kingdom of Bohemia. Budweiser. The beer was, from its first bottling, a national product in a country that had not previously had national beer products. It was mild, it was consistent, it was cold. It was in the same bottle in every city that had a Union Pacific or a Missouri Pacific rail line running through it. Its label carried the small Busch family symbol of the ram, the A, and the eagle. By the last years of the 19th century, Anheuser-Busch was producing over 1 million barrels a year of it. The German immigrant, who had stepped off a ship at 18, was the owner, with his aging father-in-law and the sisters they had married, of the first genuinely national beer company in the United States. Adolphus and Lily had 13 children in the years between 1862 and 1875. 9 of them lived to adulthood. The lost 4 are one of the still quiet facts of the family's Rhineland extraction and the St. Louis of the middle 19th century, which was in matters of infant mortality no different from any other American industrial city of its time. The 9 that lived moved between the mansions of the family in St. Louis and the villas of the family in California and in Germany. They traveled by private railway car. Their father was photographed in the frock coat of a 19th century industrial magnate, his hair swept back, his beard trimmed to a point, the gold chain of a heavy watch crossing the waistcoat, standing beside his wife, whose long, dark dress and centre-parted hair carried the German upper-middle-class propriety of the whole Rhineland generation. The country he had come to had made him one of the richest men in it. It had made her one of the great matriarchs of the American Middle West. He was building, though he did not say so, the family a tomb would be built for. His eldest son and namesake, Adolphus Busch Jr., died in 1898 at 29 years of age, of an illness the family did not name for the public record. The succession jumped a generation, and the next in line for the chair became the boy who would inherit the company in 1913, and who would, in 1934, shoot himself in his own bedroom at Grant's farm. His name was August Anheuser-Busch Sr. The founder did not live to see any of it. On the 10th of October, 1913, at 74 years of age, at a villa the family owned in Linschied, in Germany, Adolphus Busch died. The family called it the end of an era. Chapter 3. The largest fortune ever probated in Missouri. When Adolphus Busch died in a German villa on the 10th of October 1913, his estate exceeded $50 million, and Missouri had never seen its like. The number is the first thing to hold, and it is worth holding still for a moment, because the arithmetic of an American fortune in the last years before the First World War runs beyond any modern sense of what a private hoard could be. $50 million in the money of 1913 was, in the money of today, comfortably in excess of $1 billion, and by the standard measures of American economic historians, its purchasing power in the American Middle West of that year was greater still, closer to the $2 billion mark once the cost of goods and labor of that generation is set beside the cost of goods and labor of ours. It was the largest estate ever probated in the state of Missouri to that point, larger than any Vanderbilt or Astor estate ever probated in Missouri. It made the Bushes one of the great private fortunes of the American Middle West, and it made the small brewery on the wrong side of the St. Louis River into a family empire. There were mansions. There was a house at number 1 Busch Place, on the brewery grounds themselves, a red brick and iron lace industrial mansion that looked like the country seat of an English steel baron dropped inside a factory yard, in walking distance of the great Bevo bottling plant Adolphus's son August would soon put up along the same street. There was Villa Lilly at Linschied in Germany, where Adolphus died. There was a villa in Pasadena in California, and a garden the family opened to the public called Busch Gardens, which stood for many years as one of the tourist attractions of Southern California before the family closed it in the years of the Great Depression. There was a private railway car, custom fitted with brass and mahogany, in which the family crossed the American continent as though on a rolling piece of the parlor at home, from St. Louis to Pasadena and back again in each of the winter seasons of the last quarter of the 19th century. And then, on the morning of the 10th of October 1913, at 74 years of age, the founder died at Villa Lilly, half a world from the brewery. He had been convalescing there for the better part of a year, with the same sort of quiet retreat a Rhineland industrial patriarch of that generation was expected to take when his health began to fail. The country he had been born in was 3/4 of a year away from a war with the country he had made his home, and the body of the wealthiest man in the state of Missouri had somehow to be brought back. His widow, Lily, aged 69, took charge of the return. Wartime was still 9 months away, but the sea was already becoming a difficult crossing for German-American families whose loyalties would soon be publicly questioned. Lily coordinated the transfer of her husband's body from Germany back to St. Louis and held him in a temporary grave at Bellefontaine Cemetery, while an architect she had chosen worked in his studio through the drawings for the tomb. That architect was Thomas P. Barnett, She approved his drawings. She approved his choice of stone. She waited on the granite. When the tomb was finished on the highest ridge of the cemetery, in the years after 1913, the body of the founder was moved into it for good. The 3 Latin words above the door were her choice, or so the family always maintained. She had chosen them from the letters her husband had once written to her from a business trip through the Rhineland cities of his youth. Lily herself died in February of 1928, at 83 years of age, at the Busch Villa in Pasadena. She was, by every account of every member of the family in every generation after her, the still center of the household. She had borne 13 children. She had married Adolphus at 17 in the double Anheuser-Busch wedding of 1861. She had watched him build the company, and after his death, she had built the room he lay in. She had lived through the First World War and the anti-German panic that swept the American Middle West with it, through the confiscation of some of the family's German assets under the alien property custodian, through her own libel by the American wartime press, and through the 14 years of prohibition in which she watched her sons continue to run the company on bevo and yeast and ice cream. She lay down at last at the villa in Pasadena in the month of the crocuses in the winter of 1928, in an America that had almost forgotten her. Everything that went wrong in the family went wrong after she was gone. Between the death of the founder in 1913 and the death of his widow in 1928, the family bought the property that would become the physical stage of the entire long saga to follow. In 1903, 10 years before he inherited the presidency of the company, Adolphus's son, August Anheuser-Busch Sr., purchased 281 acres of gently rolling country south of the St. Louis city line. On the land stood a small stone cabin. The cabin had been built by his own hands, by a young United States Army officer named Ulysses Grant, before he went off to the war and came back a general and became the 18th president of the country. The cabin still stood on the land when August Sr. bought it. It stood on it into the century that followed. He named the property, for the cabin, Grant's Farm. The Bushes would build a great mansion on it. They would fence the land and stock it with deer. They would install a private zoo. They would open the grounds to the public and would receive presidents there. And in the master bedroom of the mansion, on a February morning in 1934, the president of Anheuser-Busch and the eldest surviving son of the founder would put a pearl-handled revolver to his chest and pull the trigger. The son who bought the land where the father would be enshrined would die in the mansion built on it by his own hand. Grant's Farm, from the day of that purchase, was, without anyone yet knowing it, a house that would keep producing bodies. Chapter 4. The Prohibition President Who Kept the Family in Business. When August A. Busch Sr. inherited Anheuser-Busch in 1913, he did not yet know that the American century's next great shock would take the family's core product off the shelves for 13 years. He was born in St. Louis in 1865, the same year in which his father Adolphus had entered the brewery partnership with Eberhard Anheuser. He was, in that sense, born inside the company. He was the third son of Adolphus and Lily, and after his older brother Adolphus Jr. died young, in the summer of 1898, he became the eldest surviving son. He entered the brewery in the 1880s, worked through its trades in the family's insisted upon apprentice fashion, learned the malting floor and the cellar and the shipping department in that order, and by the time his father died in 1913, he was already, at 48, the second man in the firm. On his father's death, he stepped up. He would run Anheuser-Busch as president and chief executive from 1913 to the day of his death in February of 1934. 21 years in the chair. His reign began under a shadow it would be hard to overstate. In the first week of August, 1914, Less than 1 year after his father's death, the country of Adolphus Busch's birth went to war with the country of his adoption. German-American families across the American Middle West lived, from that summer forward, under an anti-German panic that would last until the end of the First World War, and in some quiet ways, past the end of it. The family's German villa at Lindscheid, along with certain other family holdings in the Rhineland, was placed under wartime scrutiny. Lily Busch, in the last full decade of her life, was libeled in the American wartime press over accusations relating to her German assets, and defended her name against those accusations in the years that followed. The great German-American brewers of the country, from the Buschs in St. Louis to the Pabsts and the Schlitzers and the Millers in Milwaukee, all bore the same suspicion, and in the great scheme of American life, they never entirely recovered their pre-war standing as pillars of a certain kind of American respectability. The second shock arrived 1 year after the war ended. In January of 1920, the manufacture, sale, and transport of intoxicating liquors was made illegal across the entire United States under the 18th Amendment to the Constitution and its enabling Volstead Act. It would remain illegal for 13 years. It would kill almost every American brewery outright. It would specifically kill the trade Anheuser-Busch had been built on. And Augusta Busch Sr. stood in his father's chair with his family's whole business under a legal ban. He did what few of his competitors could do, or would think to do, or had the means to do. He diversified. The diversification had actually begun before the ban. In 1908, Adolphus Busch had directed his chief chemist to develop a non-alcoholic cereal beverage that could carry the Anheuser-Busch name into a temperance market that had been growing across the country for a generation. The product was called Bevo. It reached the shelves in 1916. It was, for a short while, one of the great business successes of the American Middle West. Over 2.2 million cases of Bevo were sold in its first 6 months on the market. The company was so bullish on it that it invested $10 million in the largest bottling plant in the world to serve it. That plant opened in 1918. The Bevo Bottling House at No. 1 Busch Place was one of the great industrial buildings of its era, a full city block long, of red brick and cathedral-height windows, with the roofline detailed in the ornamental brickwork of the Rhineland brew houses of the old country. It still stands today. Under August Sr.'s presidency during the ban itself, the company rolled out over 25 separate non-alcoholic products. There was baker's yeast, which became, within 4 years, a significant American product, and would in the middle century sit on almost every American kitchen shelf under a different brand. There was ice cream, made in the refrigerated capacity of the brewery. There was corn syrup. There was an infant formula. There were frozen eggs. There were carbonated coffee and tea products called Caffo and Busch Tea. The company's vehicle department produced a camper called the Lampsteed Camp Car, a fold-out camping body designed to fit on top of a Ford chassis, and an amphibious craft called the Bevo Victory Boat, a vehicle designed for use on land and water alike. The company sold half of its considerable real estate holdings to raise the cash to keep the whole apparatus running. It built refrigerated railway car bodies for the American food and dairy trades. It kept the workforce as much as it could. It waited. Every non-alcoholic product it launched carried an implicit promise, which the industry all understood, that when the ban ended, Anheuser-Busch would still be standing and still capable of pouring a beer. The ban ended on the 7th of April, 1933, when the Cullen-Harrison Act legalized the sale of low-alcohol beer, and finally in December of 1933, when the 21st Amendment repealed prohibition altogether. By then, almost every American brewery of any size was gone. The great German-American names of the American Middle West had been reduced, one by one, to shells or to shuttered plants. Anheuser-Busch, by the closing months of the ban, was one of only 3 or 4 American brewers of any real scale still capable of resuming full commercial brewing on the day of repeal. The company had spent 13 years selling ice cream and yeast to hold the plant together, and it had held it together. When beer became legal again, Anheuser-Busch was one of only a handful of American brewers in a position to fill an order the next morning. Within 10 years, under August Sr.'s brother August Jr. in the seat he would soon vacate, it would be the second largest brewer in the country. Within 24 years, it would be the largest brewer in the world. That reign belongs to his son. But the ground on which the son grew, the empire, was won by the father. In a 2-decade rearguard, fought under 2 of the largest external shocks any American consumer business ever survived. August Sr. had done, in the 21 years of his presidency, the hardest thing an American consumer executive of that generation could do. He had kept the company alive. The cost of that survival was carried on his own body. The years of the ban were, for the industry, a slow bleed. Great German-American brewing families, some of them older than the Anheusers on their side of the Atlantic, closed their plants, sold off their real estate, released their workforces, watched their brand names lapse from the memory of the American drinker, and became figures the trade press eulogized in retirement. Some of them died broke. Some of them died in exile from the cities they had built. August Sr. refused to be one of them. He was a man in his 50s in the middle of the ban, working 12 and 14-hour days at No. 1 Bush Place, sitting in on the yeast department in the morning, and the ice cream department in the afternoon, and the truck body department in the evening, arriving home at Grant's farm at night to a wife and to children who were, by the end of the 20s, mostly grown. He took no long holidays. He took no long winter in California. He held the plant together with a personal presence in the trades of a large industrial factory that no American consumer executive of his stature was expected to keep. By late 1933, 10 weeks after the repeal, the man who had led that fight was 68 years old, in his own bedroom at Grant's farm, in the intense, unrelieved pain of a body no doctor of that generation could adequately treat. Chapter 5. The pearl-handled revolver in the desk drawer. On the morning of February 10th, 1934, 10 weeks after the repeal of Prohibition, August A. Busch Sr. was 68 years old, in intense pain, and alone in his bedroom at the Busch Mansion at Grant's farm. The mansion at Grant's farm had been completed in 1911, 23 years before that morning. Its terraces looked out across the 281 acres of the farm. The master bedroom was on the upper floor of the house. Its windows opened over the grounds his father had bought as farmland in 1903. He had been in intense pain for more than 6 weeks. The pain came from a complication of chronic conditions. He had heart disease of the kind common in prosperous American men of that generation who had eaten and drunk well for 40 years. He had dropsy, the old term for what modern medicine calls edema, a fluid retention that in that generation attended cardiac failure and produced a swelling of the legs and feet the sufferer could feel with every step. He had gout, which added a joint pain of a specific and unbearable sharpness. Together, in a body of 68 in the last months before the widespread use of morphine as a domestic prescription and long before any real cardiac medicine, the 3 conditions produced a kind of pain a man in his position could arrange to have every possible palliative for and still not sleep through. He had a doctor at the house. He had nurses at the house. He had had, since November of 1933, an attendant on every shift. It did not help. The pain kept him awake in the small hours of the morning. It ran his weight down. It hollowed his face. One story from those weeks has survived in the family's own telling, and it is one of the strangest images the Busch archive produces. His second son, Gussie, then 34 years old, wanted to lift the old man's spirits. Gussie was a horseman, so Gussie brought a horse into the mansion and rode it up the wide central staircase of the ground floor and along the corridor of the second floor and into his father's bedroom, and stood at the sick bed with the animal beside him. The father laughed for the first time in weeks. The horse, a large, gentle carriage horse the family kept for driving, stood in the room. The son sat on it. The father, in his bed, smiled. Then the horse was led back down the stairs, one careful step at a time, its hooves ringing on the polished wooden treads. The pain, of course, was still there. Contemporary St. Louis reporting establishes the morning that followed. On the 10th of February, in his bedroom at the mansion, August Busch Sr. took a pearl-handled .32 caliber revolver from a drawer of his desk. The revolver had been his for years. Its handle was mother of pearl. Its barrel was short. It was the sort of small personal firearm a prosperous American of his class had kept in a desk drawer in a private study since the 1880s, less as a defense against intruders than as a household object out of a certain generation's habit of self-reliance. He held it against his chest, below the level of the heart. He fired one shot. The bullet entered below the heart and punctured it. He was found by staff. He was pronounced dead. The Wire report that ran in the country's evening papers that night carried the headline, "August Busch is suicide at family home." The city of St. Louis, and after St. Louis the entire American Middle West, mourned him. He had, in 21 years in the chair, been the visible face of one of the great local employers of the region through a period of two enormous external shocks. He had been the German-American brewer who had held out through the anti-German panic. He had been the Prohibition president who had refused to close the plant. He had, in the memory of every household in St. Louis whose father or son or brother had been kept on the payroll of Anheuser-Busch through the 13 years of the ban, been the man who had kept them fed. The funeral, held at the mansion and then at Bellefontaine, drew a crowd the St. Louis papers reported in the tens of thousands. Delegations from the brewery walked in procession up the long allée of oaks and elms toward the highest ridge. Executives from St. Louis and from every plant on the Anheuser-Busch system stood in the winter light along the paths. His body was placed in the family plot near his father's Gothic mausoleum on the highest ridge. The Latin over the door of the founder's tomb was, that afternoon, some 50 yards from a fresh grave. The papers reported that his son, Gussie, who had ridden the horse up the staircase in the last week of the father's life, was among the mourners at the graveside, in a heavy coat and a black tie, and did not speak. The eldest surviving son, Adolphus III, who had at 42 years of age just become the third president of Anheuser-Busch, was there in the same coat and the same tie, in his own quiet manner, and did not speak either. The company's board met the following week. It confirmed Adolphus III as president. It confirmed Gussie, at 34, as head of the brewing department. It confirmed the succession the founder himself had established in his will, and it moved on. Every element of that morning has a grounded explanation. The pain was 6 weeks old and had no adequate treatment. The revolver had been kept in the desk drawer for decades. The physical circumstance was of a body in unrelieved distress at 68 years of age, in a bedroom into which a horse had ridden a few days earlier. There is no mystery in the cause. The mystery is what happens next in the story of the house. Because from the morning of the 10th of February 1934 onward, the Busch mansion at Grant's Farm becomes, in the memory of the family, a house that keeps producing bodies. Not in a supernatural sense, in an observable, dated, generation-over-generation sense. a son on a horse in a sick room, a pearl handle in a drawer, a house on a hill above a deer park, and, from that morning, 40 years of private disaster. The presidency of the company on his death passed to his eldest surviving son. His name was Adolphus Busch III. He was 42 years old on the morning he took the office. He had been raised inside the brewery. He was quiet, competent, technically capable, socially retiring. He held the office from 1934 to the 29th of August of 1946, a run of 12 years and 6 months. His reign was uneventful, which in this family is a compliment. He is remembered by the trade press as the hinge who carried the company from the end of Prohibition into the American middle of the 20th century, and who never took a public step wrong. He rebuilt the trade. He shepherded the company through the Second World War. He served on wartime industrial boards. He died at the age of 55, in the middle of his term. The sources on the cause of his death differ. Some record it as cancer. Others record it as a cerebral hemorrhage. Either way, it removed him from the office at 55, and the chair passed, at that moment, to his younger brother. The younger brother was the son who had ridden the horse up the stairs in 1934. His name in the family, and soon in the country, was Gussie. The house at Grant's farm would keep producing bodies. It would not stop with the patriarch. Chapter 6. Camelot on the Farm. Under Gussie Busch, Anheuser-Busch became the largest brewery in the world in 1957. The Cardinals won a pennant, and Grant's Farm became a country seat that hosted 3 American presidents. August Anheuser-Busch Jr. was born on the 28th of March, 1899, the second son of August Sr. and Alice Ziesemann Busch. He grew up between the mansion at No. 1 Busch Place and the newly built house at Grant's Farm, and from the age of 4, he moved through the childhood of a St. Louis German-American industrial heir at the very peak of that class in the American Middle West. He was put to work at the brewery in 1922, at 23 years of age, sweeping floors and cleaning vats in the trade apprentice fashion that August Sr. had insisted was the only way a Busch was allowed to enter the family firm. By 1924, he was General Superintendent of Brewing Operations. After his father's death in 1934, he became head of the brewing department. After his older brother Adolphus III's death in 1946, he was installed as president. He served as chairman from 1946 until 1975, 29 years in the top chair. Under his hand, the company simply grew. It grew in a way American consumer businesses of the post-war generation grew on the great tide of the post-war American middle class, and it kept growing after the tide slackened for everyone else. The brewery produced roughly 3 million barrels a year at the end of the Second World War. It produced over 35 million by his final year in the chair. Its market share of the domestic American beer trade climbed from about 10% in the middle 1940s to over 20% by the middle 1970s. In 1957, Anheuser-Busch became the largest brewery on the face of the earth, passing Schlitz of Milwaukee, which had held the position for a generation. The St. Louis papers marked the day with a small notice in the business pages. The old man himself, then 58 and in the 5th year of the Cardinals' ownership, was said to have smiled and said little. He was a showman in a way the family had not been since the founder. He rode a wagon of Clydesdale horses. He wore a cattleman's hat and a red bow tie and a pair of aviator sunglasses that gave him, in every published photograph of the middle 50s, the look of a Missouri politician at a state fair. He kept a beer stein at his desk that he drank from every afternoon at 5 in the company of whoever was still on the executive floor at that hour. In 1953, The company bought the St. Louis Cardinals of Major League Baseball, and Gussie, in a long red, white and blue wagon drawn by 8 Clydesdales, drove the horses around the field of Busch Stadium on opening day. The company built a Busch Stadium in the middle of St. Louis. Gussie owned the Cardinals into the 1980s. In his ownership, the club won a World Series in 1964. He was, by the middle of his reign, the most recognizable American businessman in the state of Missouri, and one of the most recognizable in the country. At Grant's farm, he built a Bavarian beer garden, a deer park, a private zoo of exotic animals, and over time, an entire small country park open to the public, hosted by the company as an act of civic generosity. The general public walked the grounds in the tens of thousands every summer weekend. Presidents visited. John Wayne visited. Frank Sinatra visited. Lyndon Baines Johnson visited. The house had its own set of guest rooms for such visits, its own stables of Clydesdales and hunting horses. His youngest son, William, who would later write a memoir of the family called Family Reigns, recalled a house in which the parents entertained the great figures of American cinema and American politics in the front rooms, while a household staff of nannies raised the children in the back. Gussie was married 4 times. He had 10 or 11 surviving children, depending on the count, born across 4 decades of his private life. He was the peak of the family as a public institution. He was, when the historians of the family reach for it, the family's own Camelot. The house on the hill above the deer park, the horses, the presidents at the table, the children on ponies on the lawn, the great beer wagon rolling around the outfield of the newest ballpark in America. The Latin over the founder's tomb, at that moment, seemed to be settling into its meaning. The German immigrant of 1857 had come. He had seen. He had conquered. And his grandson stood on the hill. The rain had its shadow, of course. The family archive from the middle of Gussie's era records other losses, other private difficulties, other funerals for children of siblings and half-siblings and cousins, in the way that any large American extended family of that generation carried its share of private grief through the post-war decades. There had already been, at the very start of the reign, a family scandal the newspapers of the American Middle West had covered with the discretion of that generation. On New Year's Eve of 1930, an armed, masked gunman jumped onto the running board of a Bush family Lincoln, forced the chauffeur out, and drove off with a 13-year-old grandson of the founder in the back seat. The boy's name was Adolphus Bush Orthwein. He was held for 20 hours. He was released unharmed the following day without ransom after the kidnapper's father intervened. The kidnapper, a man named Charles Y. Abernathy of Webster Groves, a father of 7 whose real estate business had collapsed, surrendered on the 4th of January 1931. The event was, in the family's own subsequent recollection, an early beat in a pattern the family would eventually recognize. In 1930, in an America that had not yet had a Lindbergh kidnapping, it was already possible for a 13-year-old Bush to be pulled from the family car on a St. Louis road. That was in the past, when Gussie began his reign in 1946. The peak of Camelot came late. It came, in fact, in the last full decade of Gussie's reign, in the years around the World Series of 1967 and the second one of 1968 and the last flag of the era. Gussie was in his mid to late 60s. The house was full. His 4th marriage, to Margaret Beholzer, whom the family called Trudy, had produced 5 children by the middle of the 1960s. The youngest of them, born late in that decade, was the second daughter he had ever had. Her name was Christina Martina Bush. She was, by every account of everyone in the family, the light of the second half of his life. She was 8 years old in December of 1974. She rode home from school in a car through the St. Louis suburbs on an ordinary school afternoon. Chapter 7. The Road Home from School. In December 1974, Gussie Busch's youngest daughter, Christina Martina, aged 8, was killed in a car accident on her way home from school. She had been born late in his life. He had been 67 when she was born. He was 75 at the time of her death. She was, by the recollections of her much older half-brothers and half-sisters, an unusually bright and considered small child, small for her age, dark-haired, quiet. She had been given the middle name Martina. She was Gussie's youngest of 10 or 11 children, spanning by then almost 40 years of his private life, and the youngest of the 5 children he had had with Trudy Beholzer, his 4th and last wife. She was the second daughter he had ever had, the first having been born to his second wife 25 years earlier. She had, in the phrasing of one of her older half-brothers, been the child of the second Camelot. The accident is a matter of documented public fact in the local St. Louis papers of that December, and it is documented again from the family's side in her older half-brother William Busch's memoir Family Reigns, published in 2023. In that book, William, whom the family calls Billy, remembered the day of Christina's death and the day of her funeral, and the effect of her death on their father as, in his phrase, the start of the fall of Camelot. He meant the year, and he meant the month, and he meant the child. From the day of Christina's death, in his telling, the whole psychological world of Grant's Farm began to give way. The presidents no longer came. The dinners were smaller. The father did not appear on the balcony above the outfield of Busch Stadium in the same way. The Clydesdales still pulled the wagon. The company still made beer. But the father who owned all of it had stopped being able to imagine a future in which any of it mattered enough to justify the calls on his time. Gussie Busch was 75 years old that December. He had already outlived his older brother Adolphus III, who had died at 55 in 1946. He had outlived his mother Alice, who had died in the family house in the middle 1940s. He had outlived his father, who had shot himself in the master bedroom of the mansion in 1934. He had, by that December of 1974, presided over Anheuser-Busch for 29 unbroken years. He had opened the grounds of the farm to the public. He had received presidents. He had built a stadium in the middle of a city and named it for the family. And on an ordinary Missouri afternoon in the last month of that year, in a car on a school road, the youngest of his children was killed at 8 years old. The public record on the accident is unusually sparse, and this is not accidental. Missouri press coverage at the time was gentler than a modern reader might expect. The family did not seek publicity. The child's death was reported. The details of the collision were reported in a manner respectful of the family, and then the papers stepped back. The care of the small girl's memory was, in the way of great families of the American Middle West in that era, left to the household and to the church. She was buried at Bellefontaine Cemetery in the Busch family section, near the mausoleum of her great-grandfather Adolphus. Her grave carried, and carries, only her name and the years of her short life. What survives on the public record is the fact of it, and the date of it, and the effect it had on the man in the chair at Anheuser-Busch. The effect began to be visible within weeks. Gussie became, in the memory of executives who worked with him at that time, and in the later summary of authors Peter Hernan and Terry Gainey in their book On the Family Under the Influence, an increasingly difficult figure in the boardroom of the company. His grief was, in the description of those inside the room, unmanageable. He would not consider succession plans. He would not agree to the retirement he had already sketched out for himself in the years before her death. He would not let go of decisions that ought to have been passed to the operating chief he had been grooming for a decade. He began, in the first months of 1975, to speak in private and in company councils about a plan that had never before been on the agenda of the family. He began to talk, quietly, and then not so quietly, about selling Anheuser-Busch outright to another company. The company he named was the tobacco firm R.J. Reynolds. The R.J. Reynolds proposal, in the recollection of the Anheuser-Busch executives close to him at the time, was not, in the beginning, a firm decision. It was amusing. It was a way of releasing the pressure of a company he could no longer fully feel. In the winter and spring of 1975, however, it began to take on the shape of a directive. He asked for figures. He asked for structures. He asked for outside counsel to sound out the tobacco firm on a possible merger of a scale that would have collapsed a century of the family's identity into a subsidiary of a Winston-Salem cigarette business. There would be no such sale. The board of Anheuser-Busch, in the spring of 1975, had a private conversation about the man in the chairman's office and about the direction of the company, and they came to a decision. The decision was made by a group of directors led by the man Gussie had spent the last decade grooming for the succession. That man was Gussie's own son, born of his second wife. His name was August Adolphus Busch III. The road home from school had, in less than 5 months, produced 2 consequences. One was the death of a child. The other was the moment at which the family began, from the inside, to devour itself. Chapter 8. The Son at the Boardroom Door. 5 months after Christina's death, in May 1975, Gussie Busch was voted out of his own company by a coup led by his eldest son. The son had been organizing for years. The Hernan and Gainey account, corroborated by later trade press summaries, describes August Busch III as a man who, from at least the early 1970s, had been building a private base of executive support against the possibility that his father would one day decline to leave the office voluntarily. He had brought certain senior operating men into his confidence over long lunches at Grant's farm and over private working dinners in the executive suite. He had made himself the technically indispensable figure inside the brewery, the man who ran the plants and the trade, who knew every brewmaster's name and every distributor's numbers and every reformulation the pilot brewery was working on. He had positioned himself to be the only serious internal answer to any question about the future of the company, and he had, in the middle years of the 1970s, begun to feel the pressure of a father who did not seem to be leaving. The trigger, in the historian's account, was Gussie's talk of the R.J. Reynolds sale. The son considered such a sale a betrayal of everything the family stood for, and everything the German immigrant in the Gothic tomb had built. A tobacco company at the head of an American brewery, a Winston-Salem executive suite dictating brewing decisions in St. Louis. He would not have it. He acted. In May of 1975, the board of Anheuser-Busch met, and in a series of votes, it removed the 75-year-old chairman from operational control of the company. He was replaced, effective immediately, by his own son. The son was 37 years old. The father was permitted to retain the title of chairman for a further 2 years, in a face-saving arrangement negotiated by the directors closest to the family. He was permitted, so long as he agreed to the fiction of a voluntary retirement, to continue running the St. Louis Cardinals baseball team, which the company owned as a subsidiary. He was required to state publicly that his exit from operational control had been his own decision. He agreed. He held the fiction publicly for the remaining 14 years of his life. The truth of the Ulster, which was that his son had put together a boardroom coup and taken the company from him in the middle of his grief over the child's death, was not fully public until Gussie's own death in 1989, when the historians of the American beer business, freed of the possibility of libel from the family, put the record together and told the truth of it. What the country had believed was that Gussie had gracefully stepped aside. What had happened, actually, was that his son had voted him out. Gussie did not, in the 14 years remaining to him, ever publicly acknowledge that this was what had happened. He continued to appear on the balcony above the Cardinals' field. He continued to ride the beer wagon on opening day of every season. He entertained, though on a reduced scale. He aged. He gave interviews in which he referred to the son who had voted him out as a fine young executive who was doing well by the company. The interviews were quoted back to him by no one. He was 90 years old on the 28th of March, 1989. He died at Grant's Farm on the 29th of September of that year, in the mansion in which his father had shot himself in 1934, 55 years and 7 months and 19 days after the pearl-handled revolver had gone off in the master bedroom of the same house. He was survived by 9 of his children, 27 grandchildren, and 9 great-grandchildren. The funeral filled Bellefontaine Cemetery to a depth the ridge had not seen since his father's own funeral in the winter of 1934. The obituaries the following week in the St. Louis papers and in the trade press across the American Middle West treated him as the last of an era. The Camelot on the farm had by then been over for 15 years. The Cardinals had won a World Series in 1982 under his ownership, in the ballpark named for the family, and the moment had felt to those close to him like a last gift. The truth of the coup, which had been the private knowledge of the boardroom for 14 years, was, in the weeks after his death, published for the first time. Peter Hernan and Terry Gainey's book, Under the Influence, released shortly afterward, carried it in full. The version of Gussie the country had known had, in the same week, gone into the ground. The coup was not the only crack in the family in the years around that vote. In November of 1976, 18 months after his father was removed from the company chair, Gussie's son, Peter M. Bush, then 18 years old, was in a bedroom with his friend David Leaker, the son of the president of a St. Louis potato chip company called So Good Potato Chip Company. Peter picked up a handgun. In the accepted account, and in his own testimony, he tossed the gun onto the bed. The gun discharged. The single shot killed David Leaker. The St. Louis press covered the shooting in the manner it had covered every Bush family incident for 2 generations, discreetly and with the details set out in the middle sections of the paper. The Washington Post ran a wire item in January of 1977 under the headline, "Bush heir pleads guilty." Peter M. Bush pleaded guilty to the reduced charge of manslaughter in that month. He was given 5 years probation. The Hernan and Gainey history records that he had been, in that period of his life, in his own words, infatuated with guns, and that earlier, the same year, he had accidentally shot himself in the leg. The pattern of firearms in and around Bush bedrooms, first visible in February of 1934 in his own grandfather's master bedroom, had, by the end of 1976, produced 2 documented shootings inside the family in the space of 42 years, in each of which a gun kept in a private room of a Bush residence had produced a death. The father in the boardroom in May of 1975, 5 months after burying a child of 8 and 18 months before another son would kill a friend on a bed, is the collapse image of this generation. A 75-year-old man, one of the most recognizable industrial figures in America, sitting in a room in the Anheuser-Busch executive suite in the middle of the American Middle West, being voted out by his own eldest boy. The son who did this to his father would, 33 years later, do the same thing to his own son. He had learned. Chapter 9. The Third. They called him the Third or Three Sticks, and inside Anheuser-Busch, he ran the company with a pathological punctuality that had brewmasters answering the phone at 4 in the morning. August Adolphus Busch III was born on the 16th of June, 1937. He was the eldest son of Gussie by his second wife, Elizabeth Overton Dozier. He entered the brewery young, in the trade apprentice fashion of the family, and made his career on the operations side. He was known inside the plants by two nicknames. Employees called him the Third, after his numbering. Executives called him Three Sticks, for the same reason, but in the private slang of the trade. He answered to both. He became president of Anheuser-Busch in 1974. He became chief executive in May of 1975 in the boardroom vote that ended his father's operational reign. He became chairman in 1977. He would hold the chief executive title until June of 2002. He would hold the chairmanship until 2006. 27 years in the top chair. It was, and remains, the longest single reign in the history of the company. Under his hand, Anheuser-Busch went from 34 million barrels a year to nearly 100 million. Its share of the domestic American beer market rose above 48%, a figure no other American brewer of the 20th century had ever attained. Its stock price multiplied many times over. The company launched the Bud Light brand into a low-calorie beer segment it would come to dominate. It absorbed craft breweries. It absorbed distributors. It rebuilt the plants at No. 1 Busch Place. It exported the beer. It grew and grew and grew. And it grew because the man at the top ran the operation with a discipline that unnerved the entire trade press. He was famously punctual. He was famously involved in the smallest brewing detail. He was famous for cold-calling brewmasters at the pilot brewery at 4 o'clock in the morning to ask about a temperature reading he had noticed on a report he had taken home from the office the night before. He arrived at the office early. He left the office late. He did not smile easily. He did not tolerate small talk. He kept a small office, austere by the standard of a chief executive of the largest brewery in the world, in the executive suite at the top of the brewery, with a view over the yards and the shipping platforms. He was, in the memory of everyone who worked for him, the coldest and most exacting American consumer executive of his generation. He was, and this word matters, effective. Anheuser-Busch, under his rule, was the best-run large American brewery in a country that produced great American breweries. The private cost of that discipline is documented in every family profile that has been written about him. He divorced August IV's mother, Susan Hornibrook, when their son was 5 years old. He kept the boy with him only intermittently after the divorce. The father-son time that the two of them had, in the report of a Forbes profile from the early 1990s and subsequent restatements in the CBS News and NBC News coverage of the 2010 Adrienne Martin case, was spent almost entirely at the brewery and consisted almost entirely of the son being brought along on a shift and being expected to observe. The son did not, in this account, ever really have a father in the ordinary sense. The son had a chief executive who happened to be his father. The distinction was drawn early, and it held. The third was the second Busch in 3 generations to remove a father from the top chair of the company. He had done it to Gussie in 1975, in a coup he had spent years organizing. He was, at every stage of his own reign, a man conscious that a boardroom is a place in which a family member can be voted out. He did not, during his reign, permit any part of the ownership of the company to drift out of family control. He did not, during his reign, allow the succession to lapse. He was, in the private sense that mattered to him, a Busch protecting the Bush throne against the possibility that someone from outside the family might one day sit in it. He did not, in the end, protect it. That is the paradox of his reign, and it is the one every business history of the family has had to reckon with. He was the most disciplined Bush in the history of the company. He was the most effective Bush in the history of the company. He ruled the longest. He grew it the most. And on his watch, in the summer of 2008, sitting as a director in the boardroom in which he had presided for so long, he argued for the sale of Anheuser-Busch to a Belgian-Brazilian conglomerate over the objections of his own son, the sitting chief executive. The private register in which his life ran, throughout those 27 years, has been sketched in every serious profile of him. He hunted, he fished, he kept horses. He gave, in his own way, generously to St. Louis institutions. The men who worked closest to him described him as a boss who could be, when he chose to be, unexpectedly warm. The public knew none of that. The public knew three sticks. The man in the executive suite who ran the largest brewery in the American Middle West, with a temperature reading in his head at all times. The private and the public, in his case, were two different men, and they were reconciled by no one. Before that vote, however, there was the weight he had made his son sit through. In 2002, he stepped down as chief executive. The world assumed, and August the 4th assumed, that the son would step up. He did not step up. The board named someone else, in a decision his own father did not fight. Chapter 10. The son held at the door. In 2002, August Bush III stepped down as chief executive, and the board did not choose his son to replace him. The board chose Patrick T. Stokes, a veteran Anheuser-Busch operating executive who was not a member of the family. He was, in the trade press assessment of the time, a competent operator with a full understanding of the company's plants and distribution. He was not a Bush. He became, on that day in July of 2002, the first non-Bush chief executive in the entire history of the company. In the entire history of the Anheuser-Busch Brewing Association, from the reorganization of 1879 forward, no one from outside the family had ever held the office. Stokes did. The decision was formally the board's. The decision was, in every business press account of the transition, the father's. August III had it in his power, as the outgoing chief executive and the sitting chairman, to move the board toward his son. He did not. He installed instead a career operating man he trusted, told the trade that Stokes would serve as a caretaker, while August IV continued to run the domestic beer operation and demonstrate readiness, and let his son wait. The son waited for 4 years. He was 38 years old when Stokes was installed. He would be 42 years old when he was finally elevated. In the meanwhile, he ran the domestic beer division. He hit his numbers. He toured the plants. He appeared at trade events. He argued for aggressive marketing to a new generation of American drinkers, and won some of those arguments and lost others. He waited. The signal to the trade was clear, and to the family it was crushing. The father who had voted his own father out at 37 in his own turn had held his son at the door of the chair. He had done so, he indicated in public statements, and because he did not consider his son ready. He did so, in the private view of everyone in the family and everyone in the industry, for reasons that were more complex and more personal than that. He had ruled Anheuser-Busch alone for 27 years. Handing the office to his son was, in some sense, the end of that reign. He was not in a hurry to end it. In the middle of the wait, he made a public statement that would be quoted back to him for the rest of his life. In 2006, speaking to trade press about his decision to step back from the marketing side of the company, he said, in his own words, that he had lost the ability to understand the 21 to 30-year-old drinker the way he used to. It was in the context of a company whose entire growth engine had for a generation been the young American male beer drinker, an extraordinary admission from an outgoing chief executive. It was also, in retrospect, an admission that the case for his son to take the office was strong. The son ran that segment. He had the ear of that generation. The father had said, in effect, that the son was better positioned than he was to keep growing the flagship brand into a new decade of American consumers. On the 1st of December 2006, August Busch IV was named President and Chief Executive Officer of Anheuser-Busch Companies Incorporated. He was 42 years old. He was the sixth member of his family to hold that office. He walked into the office his father had held for 27 years, and his grandfather Gussie had held for 29, and his great-uncle Adolphus III had held for 12, and his great-grandfather August Sr. had held for 21, and his great-great-grandfather Adolphus had built 27, 29, 12, 21. 4 generations of continuous family reign added up to a sum of 89 years in the chief executive's chair, not counting the founder's own presidency. The trade press, on the day of the announcement, ran the customary large photographs. The son at the desk, the father, in a smaller frame, on the wall behind him. The plants of number 1 Busch Place in the middle distance over the roofs of South St. Louis. The company's stock, on the news, rose modestly. The distributors, across the country, sent the customary telegrams of congratulation to the executive suite. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch, the following morning, ran an editorial on the succession and framed it as the natural continuation of the Busch dynasty into a 5th generation, and expressed, in the measured language of the paper of record of the city, cautious confidence. The son, who had been held at the door for 4 years, would sit in the chair for 19 months. Chapter 11. The Corvette on the Curve. On November 13, 1983, on a curve outside Tucson, a 1984 Chevrolet Corvette left the road at high speed, and its passenger, a 22-year-old waitress named Michelle Frederick, died in the wreck. He had not, at that point in his life, ever run the company. He was 20 years old. He was a student at the University of Arizona. He had been enrolled there in the autumn of 1981, following the ordinary path of a St. Louis heir in his generation. He was the son of the chief executive of Anheuser-Busch and the great-great-grandson of the founder. He drove a new Chevrolet Corvette his father had let him take out to the desert. He drank in the small Tucson bars that lay along the eastern edge of the city, on the roads that ran up into the Rincon foothills. On the night of the 12th of November, in one of those bars, he met Michelle Frederick. She was 22 years old. She was a waitress. She had grown up in the American Middle West and had come to Arizona in the way many young Americans of the early 1980s came to the Sunbelt cities of the American Southwest in search of a warmer year and a fresh start. She was not a public figure. She had no history in the tabloid press. She was, in the terminology of the Wire report that would carry her name across the country the next day, a young waitress. On the night of the 12th of November, they left the bar together in the new Corvette. In the small hours of the 13th of November, the Corvette left the road on a curve and struck an object at high speed. The exact point of the crash has, over the years since, been described in local Arizona press retrospectives as a curve on a road east of Tucson, where a number of vehicles had come to grief over the years, and which local officers referred to among themselves by a specific name. The Corvette came off the road at that curve, at what investigating officers later estimated as a considerable speed above the posted limit. and struck a roadside object with sufficient force to end the life of its passenger at the scene. Michel Frederick was killed at the scene. Busch was well enough to walk. He walked from the wreck. He did not report the accident. He did not summon the police. He did not summon medical assistance. He was found by Arizona police roughly 6 hours after the accident at his own home. He was disoriented. He had a fractured skull. He was taken to a hospital. He was interviewed. He gave, in the accepted account, an incomplete recollection of the events of the night, consistent with a serious head injury and consistent with several hours of intervening confusion and consistent in the reading of the Arizona authorities, with impaired ability to give a coherent statement. Inside the wrecked Corvette, an Arizona officer at the scene documented the presence of a .44 caliber Magnum revolver and a wallet containing a Missouri driver's license issued in the name of August A. Busch IV. The revolver was legally owned. The wallet was his. The passenger seat, when the crash was recorded, held the body of Michel Frederick, who had not survived long enough to be moved to a hospital. An Arizona investigation took 7 months. It examined the trajectory of the Corvette on the curve. It examined the speed of the vehicle at impact. It examined the sequence of events at the bar earlier in the evening. It examined the physical evidence at the scene. It examined the sequence in which Busch had left the wreck, walked to his home, and been found 6 hours later with a fractured skull. It examined the toxicology available to it, given the interval between the crash and the medical intervention. In June of 1984, the authorities announced that they would not pursue criminal charges against August Busch IV in the death of Michel Frederick. The reason given was that the evidence available to them was not adequate to sustain a prosecution. He was 20 years old. His father was chief executive of Anheuser-Busch. Michel Frederick was buried by her family in the American Middle West. The record of the case in the Arizona archives remained sealed to the depth the state permits. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch of the 13th of November, 1983, carried a report of the death of a young waitress in a crash of a new Corvette in Arizona involving a young man named August Busch IV. The report was picked up on the wires. Later reporting on the case, notably the CBS News summaries at the time of the 2010 wrongful death case involving another woman, referred back to the Tucson crash as, in the trade's own phrasing, an unsettled event in the young man's history that had never been legally resolved. The Frederick family, for a long time after the crash, was silent on the matter in the American press. Michelle's grave, in her family's plot in the American Middle West, carries her name and the years of her short life, as such graves do. She was, in the accounting the trade press would later keep, the first of 2 young women whose lives ended in physical proximity to August Busch IV. The pattern of firearms in and around Busch vehicles begins here, in the passenger compartment of the wrecked Corvette on a Tucson curve in the small hours of the 13th of November, in the year in which his father had already been chief executive of Anheuser-Busch for 8 years. The .44 caliber Magnum revolver in the wreck rhymes, unmistakably and across almost 50 years, with the pearl-handled .32 caliber revolver in the desk drawer of the Busch mansion at Grant's Farm on the 10th of February 1934. It rhymes as well with the handgun that discharged on a bed in Missouri in November of 1976 and killed a young man named David Leaker. 4 Busch generations. 4 documented incidents in which a firearm changes a family life on a specific dated day. The empty passenger seat of the Corvette on the roadside outside Tucson is the collapse image of the young man who, 23 years later, on the 1st of December 2006, would walk into the office of the chief executive of Anheuser-Busch Companies Incorporated as the 6th Busch in that seat. He arrived carrying every incident he had ever survived, and one incident, in the shape of an unfilled passenger seat, he had not. Chapter 12. 19 months in the chair. On the 1st of December 2006, August Busch IV walked into the office his great-grandfather had once held and became the 6th Bush to run Anheuser-Busch. He was 42 years old. He had waited, at his father's discretion, for 4 years. He had spent those 4 years running the domestic beer operation under the caretaker chief executive Patrick Stokes. He had, in the assessment of the trade press at the time of his elevation, delivered his numbers. He had made peace, at least in public, with the fact that his father had held him at the door. He inherited an American beer company with a market share of near half of the domestic beer trade, a portfolio anchored on Budweiser and Bud Light, a network of plants and distributors of unequaled scale, and a market capitalization that placed it comfortably among the largest American consumer businesses. He held the office for the shortest tenure of any Bush chief executive in the history of the company. The 19 months of August IV's reign, from December of 2006 to the last week of July of 2008, are described in the definitive business history of the takeover, Julie McIntosh's book, Dethroning the King, published by Wiley in 2010. McIntosh's account, corroborated by contemporary CNBC and NBC News coverage of the deal, is the story of an American consumer icon being pursued and finally taken over the objections of the sitting Bush in the chief executive's chair. His early months in the office ran, on their own terms, well. The company's numbers held. The domestic market share remained strong. He launched initiatives on new product categories, on premium extensions of Budweiser, on marketing that spoke to a generation his father had said he no longer understood. He appeared at the plants. He walked the shipping platforms. He gave the executive floor, in the memory of his colleagues from that period, a slightly less austere air than his father had given it. He was still, however, an Anheuser-Busch chief executive in the 6th generation. He was still the son of 3 sticks. He was still, in every meeting, aware of the numbers his father had run for 27 years. The pursuit began in earnest in the spring of 2008. The pursuer was InBev, a Belgian and Brazilian brewing conglomerate formed through a series of earlier consolidations, headquartered in the small Belgian city of Leuven. Its senior executives, drawn largely from a group of Brazilian financial engineers who had earlier taken over the Belgian brewer Interbrew, had studied Anheuser-Busch as an acquisition target for years. They had modelled the operating synergies. They had modelled the cost cuts that a global acquirer, running Anheuser-Busch as a subsidiary rather than as an independent American icon, could extract from the business. They had modelled the price at which the offer would be irresistible to the American shareholder base. They had, in the private tradition of their firm, waited for the right week to move. They moved in May and June of 2008. The offer, at the level at which the board took it up, was $70 a share. It valued Anheuser-Busch, in the aggregate, at $52 billion. August Busch IV publicly opposed the sale. In interviews and in trade press statements from June and early July of 2008, he described the offer as the wrong deal at any price, and he described his intention to fight it with a defensive campaign. His campaign centered on a case to the board of Anheuser-Busch that the company was undervalued at $70 a share, and that a period of strong operating discipline, executed by the family and by the existing senior team, could deliver a higher long-term value to shareholders than any InBev deal could match. He toured the plants. He met with distributors. He spoke to the trade. He argued. He also spoke in his own way to the country. Editorial pages in the American Middle West lined up behind him. The great old American icon, Anheuser-Busch, was, in the summer of 2008, in a fight for its independence, and its chief executive was leading the fight. He lost the argument inside the boardroom. McIntosh's account, corroborated by NBC News's contemporaneous reporting, identifies the crucial voice inside that boardroom, the voice that turned the internal debate against August IV's defense. It was his father, August Busch III, sitting as a director of the company he had ruled for 27 years, argued to his fellow directors that the fight for independence could not be won, that the InBev price was the best price the family and the shareholders would ever see for the company, and that a rejection would produce, in the medium term, a lower price and a bruised business. It was, in the fiduciary framing on which he stood, a straightforward argument. It was also, in the family framing, that no one in the room could quite name aloud the second time in 33 years that this man had, from a Bush boardroom seat, voted against a Bush in the chief executive's chair. The son who had voted his father out of the company chair in May of 1975, 5 months after that father had buried an 8-year-old, would, in July of 2008, hand the company itself to a foreign buyer over the resistance of his own son. He had learned. He had also become, in that same procedural move, the second Bush to end a Bush's tenure at the top of the family firm. The boardroom filled against August IV. The vote came. He was the sitting chief executive, and he signed. In the last week before the vote, in the last hours in which the argument was still, in the boardroom, open, the son had asked the directors, in the language of the family, for one further stay. He asked for a rejection of the $70 offer and a return to the table with a counter-proposal that would raise the offer to a level at which the fight for independence could be reopened in the medium term. He was refused. The directors had, by then, done the arithmetic on which the elder Bush had rested his case. $70 a share was the highest number any American beer company had ever been offered by any acquirer. The fiduciary duty to shareholders, in the reading of the room, was to accept. The son had opposed the sale from the outside. Then he had opposed the sale from inside the room. Then, on the vote, he had signed. The other directors in the room, and the analysts who wrote the definitive accounts of the transaction in the years afterward, described the atmosphere in the boardroom on the weekend of the 12th and 13th of July as unusually quiet. There was no confrontation. There was no scene. There was, in the room, a father and a son and a set of numbers, and the numbers carried the day. Chapter 13. The vote that ended it. On July 13, 2008, an Anheuser-Busch board voted to accept the InBev bid at $70 a share for an aggregate equity value of $52 billion. The vote is the punishment beat of the whole 150-year story of the family and the company, and it is the day the cold open of this film is set on. It is worth being precise about it. The board of Anheuser-Busch Companies Incorporated, meeting over the weekend of the 12th and 13th of July, 2008, in St. Louis, voted to accept a revised offer from Anheuser-Busch InBev, then simply InBev, valuing each share of Anheuser-Busch common stock at $70 in cash and valuing the equity of the whole company at approximately $52 billion. The board's action was announced on the 14th of July. The proxy statements filed with the United States Securities and Exchange Commission carry the finished text of the merger. The transaction closed later that year, following shareholder and regulatory approval. Anheuser-Busch, from the closing date forward, was a subsidiary of a Belgian-Brazilian conglomerate headquartered in the small Belgian city of Leuven. The name over the door in St. Louis stayed. The controlling authority went to Europe. August Busch IV signed. As the sitting chief executive, he had, whatever his private position on the deal, no realistic alternative in the last hours before the vote. His consulting agreement with the combined company was to run through the year 2013. He was to hold a seat on the merged board. The consulting fee and the board seat were the price of the concession, and they were, in the language of a large public company merger, entirely normal. He collected them. The elder Busch collected far more. As one of the largest individual family shareholders in Anheuser-Busch, August Busch III received, on the closing of the merger, a very large sum in cash for the shares he had held. He remained a director of the merged company for some time after the closing. He had, in the fiduciary framing on which his boardroom argument had rested, delivered to his fellow shareholders the best price obtainable for the company. He had also, in the family framing that only Julie McIntosh's book would name in public, presided over the end of the Busch's 150-year hold on their own brewery. The Latin over the door of the tomb on the highest hill of Bellefontaine Cemetery was, on the 14th of July, 2008, answered in a way the founder could not have imagined and would not have written. Adolphus Busch had come and had seen and had conquered. The great-great-grandson of Adolphus Busch had come, had seen, and had signed. The signature was not, in the strict technical sense, a defeat. The signature was, in the strict technical sense, the highest ever price paid for an American beer company. The signature was, at the same time, the end. Newspapers across the American Middle West carried the news the next morning. Editorials in St. Louis, in Milwaukee, in Kansas City, in Denver, wrote what the American beer trade had been thinking for several weeks. Anheuser-Busch, the last of the great German-American breweries of the 1860s still under founding family control, had ended 150 years of that control. The Clydesdale horses would still pull the wagon. The Cardinals would still play in the stadium named for the family. Grant's Farm would still be walked by the public on summer weekends, and the beer of the same name would still be brewed at No. 1 Busch Place in South St. Louis. But the ownership of the company was in Belgium. There is a moment in every closing of a great merger in which the sitting chief executive and the outgoing chairman stand together for a photograph in front of the wire services of the country. In the case of the 2008 InBev transaction, that photograph exists, and any careful viewer studying it can see two men. One is August Busch IV, at 44 years of age, in a dark suit, with the composure required of the occasion. The other is his father, at 71 years of age, in a dark suit, with a composure of a different order. It is the collapse image of the deal, and it is the second occasion in this family of a father and a son standing on the same corporate stage after a boardroom in which the father's voice has ended the son's mandate. The pattern that had shown itself in May of 1975 in the office of the chief executive of Anheuser-Busch, when a 37-year-old August III had, in a fiduciary framing, moved his own board against his 75-year-old father Gussie, was in force again. The same man, a different son, the same result. The Busch family had not lost Anheuser-Busch to a hostile European raider. The Busch family had voted to sell Anheuser-Busch to a Belgian-Brazilian conglomerate. The vote had been carried, in the room, by the family's most senior director. The company that had carried the family name for 150 years had, in the final analysis, been handed over by the family itself. The aftermath, in the ordinary business sense, was orderly. The merger closed in the last weeks of 2008. Anheuser-Busch Companies Incorporated ceased to exist as an independent American public company. Anheuser-Busch InBev, headquartered in Leuven, took its place as the merged parent. The St. Louis executive offices were retained. The trademarks were retained. The plants were retained. In the years after the merger, the Brazilian executive team that had built InBev applied to Anheuser-Busch the operating discipline the trade press had long expected. Costs were cut. Certain long-standing sponsorships were reviewed. Certain product lines were rationalized. The Clydesdale program was, for a while, protected as a piece of the American brand equity the Belgian-Brazilian ownership had bought. None of it was untoward. All of it was, in the language of the modern global consumer merger, exactly as advertised. The plant at No. 1 Busch Place kept brewing. The Cardinals kept playing in Busch Stadium. Grant's Farm kept its gates open on summer weekends. The great Bevo bottling house of 1918 stood as it had stood for 90 years, a red brick monument to a family and a decade in which an American brewery had kept itself alive on ice cream and yeast against a national ban. The name over the door was the same. The signature at the bottom of the merger document, however, ended the era in which that name meant a Bush in the chief executive's chair. It would not again. Chapter 14. The Girlfriend in the Mansion. On the morning of December 19, 2010, in a $2 million gated mansion in Frontenac, Missouri, 27-year-old aspiring model Adrienne Martin was found dead in the bed of former Anheuser-Busch chief executive August Busch IV. He was 46 years old. 2.5 years had passed since the vote of the 13th of July, 2008. He was no longer chief executive of Anheuser-Busch. He held the honorary board seat that had come with the merger. He was collecting the consulting fee that ran through the year 2013. He was living in a large gated house in the affluent inner ring St. Louis suburb of Frontenac, on a walled property whose market value was reported in the local St. Louis press at approximately $2 million. The Frontenac house had been his private residence throughout the last years of his tenure at Anheuser-Busch. It was staffed, it was walled, it was gated. It was the fifth-generation Busch house. Adrienne Nicole Martin was 27 years old. She was the mother of a young son named Blake, by her former husband, Dr. Kevin Martin. She was, at the time of her death, an aspiring model. She had been dating August Busch IV for approximately 1 year. She had spent the previous evening at the house in Frontenac. On the morning of the 19th of December, according to the initial account of the emergency call given to the St. Louis County Medical Examiner's Office, Adrienne Martin was found unresponsive in a bed at the house. Emergency services were called. She was pronounced dead at the scene. There was, in the initial reporting from ABC News and NBC News covering the case that week, some dispute about the length of time that had passed between her being found unresponsive and the placement of the emergency call. The initial reports referred to a delay of approximately 40 minutes. Busch, through counsel, later disputed the characterization of that gap and stated that the call had been placed immediately by a house employee. The St. Louis County Medical Examiner completed the autopsy in the first weeks of 2011. The finding was that Adrienne Martin had died of an accidental overdose of the prescription painkiller oxycodone. The finding did not identify a source of the drug in the house and did not implicate Busch personally in her death. The case was closed for the purposes of criminal investigation. The civil case was another matter. The ex-husband of Adrienne Martin, Dr. Kevin Martin, filed a wrongful death lawsuit in Missouri Civil Court on behalf of his and Adrienne's young son, Blake. The case was settled in November of 2011 for $1.75 million. Under the terms of the settlement, $1.35 million was placed in trust for Blake Martin. The balance of the settlement was divided between Adrienne Martin's parents, named in the court record as Larry Eby and Christine Trampler. Busch's counsel stated at the time of the settlement that the payment was not to be interpreted as an admission of negligence. The public record was closed on the matter. The pattern that repeats here is the pattern the CBS News summary of the case at the time named openly. In November of 1983, a young woman named Michelle Frederick had died in the passenger seat of a car Bush had been driving in Arizona, and no criminal charges had followed. In December of 2010, a young woman named Adrienne Martin had died in a bed in a house Bush owned in Missouri, and no criminal charges had followed. Two young women, one in her early 20s and one in her late 20s, dead in the physical vicinity of the same man, 27 years apart. The pattern was named by the country's business and general press within days of Martin's death. The house in Frontenac is the fifth-generation Bush house. It is not the mansion at Grant's farm. The distance in geography and in decade is real, and yet the compositional resemblance is unmistakable, and it should be named. The head Bush of the family, in the private residence of the head Bush of the family, on a dated day, produces a body. In February of 1934, that body was his own. In December of 2010, that body was a young woman's. The gap in circumstance between the two events is the whole distance between the two eras. The gap in composition, in the flat morphological sense, is nil. The wrongful death settlement of November of 2011 closed the civil consequences of the case. There has been, in the years since, no further criminal action. Adrienne Martin's son, Blake, at the time of the settlement, was a small boy. The $2 million house in Frontenac continued to be the residence of August Bush IV. He was, by the closing months of 2011, out of the operating side of the beer business entirely, and would remain so. The trade press coverage of Martin's death, in the days and weeks after the 19th of December, is worth pausing on for a moment, because it is the moment at which the country's business press first named the pattern in the terms this film has named it. The Forbes profile of the summer of 2019, headlined, "For this Anheuser-Busch Air Trouble Followed," laid out the sequence with the arithmetic clarity trade press profiles reserved for the very small number of American executives whose private lives have entered the public record. The CBS News summary of the same period listed the events in the same order. 1983, the Corvette. 2010, the mansion. The two young women. The intervening deals. The consulting fee. The board seat. The house in Frontenac. The pattern that no individual event by itself could quite carry, but that the sum, over a lifetime, could not shake off. It is the pattern this film has walked. He had one more public incident to add to the record, and it came 6 years later, in a July afternoon in an office park near St. Louis, in a helicopter. Chapter 15. The Helicopter in the Office Park. On a July afternoon in 2017, an unauthorized helicopter landed in an office park near St. Louis, and by 8 that evening, the police were back because the pilot appeared too intoxicated to fly. The initial call to St. Louis area police came in the early afternoon. Witnesses reported that a helicopter had landed in the parking area of a business office park without prior clearance or permission from the property owner or the local authorities. Officers responded. They spoke to the pilot. They did not, in that first encounter, make an arrest. The pilot was identified as August Bush IV. Several hours later that evening, the same police were called back to the same office park. Witnesses this time reported that the pilot had returned to the helicopter and appeared to be preparing to take off, and that he appeared, in the description given to the arriving officers, too intoxicated to fly. Officers detained him. Inside the helicopter, the officers documented what they found. There were, in the count they took at the scene, 8 dogs. There were multiple loaded firearms. There were several bottles of prescription drugs. 2 of the bottles were prescribed to Bush. One held alprazolam, an anti-anxiety medication. Another held clonazepam, a related anti-anxiety medication. A third bottle held letrozole, a fertility drug, prescribed not to him but to his wife. He was, by then, married to a woman named Catherine Thatcher, and the couple were pursuing a course of assisted fertility treatment. He was administered a breath test. He blew a reading of 000. He was administered a field sobriety test. He could not follow some of the instructions and could not complete some of the steps. He was, in the closing report, not charged with a driving under the influence offence in view of the zero breath test. The Federal Aviation Authorities carried the incident on their record. The St. Louis area press covered it for several days. He returned to the private business interests he had held since the merger of 2008. The pattern of firearms across the 4 generations of Bush heirs since 1934 now stands complete. In February of 1934, a Pearl-handled .32 caliber revolver in the desk drawer of the master bedroom at the Bush mansion at Grant's Farm ended the life of a company president in intense pain. In November of 1976, a handgun on a bed in Missouri ended the life of a friend of an 18-year-old Bush. In November of 1983, a .44 caliber Magnum revolver rode in the passenger compartment of a wrecked Corvette in Arizona, in which a young woman named Michelle Frederick died. In July of 2017, multiple loaded firearms rode in an unauthorized helicopter in an office park near St. Louis. 4 generations, 4 documented events. The gun, as an object motif, moves down the family with the money. 2 footnotes belong to this segment, and they close out the aftermath. The first is Craftig. In 2011, William K. Bush, whom the family calls Billy, and who was Gussie's son by his 4th wife Trudy, and the older brother of the 8-year-old Christina, who had died in 1974, founded a small brewing company in St. Louis called William K. Bush Brewing Company. Its 2 beers were Craftig, a Pilsner, and Craftig Light. The founding was described by Billy Bush at the time as an attempt to brew a beer in the family tradition, on the family's own terms, in the family's own city, at a distance from the Belgian-Brazilian conglomerate that now owned the great name in South St. Louis. The company's volumes fell over its later years. By 2019, annual volume was down to about 7,000 barrels. In that year, Billy Bush announced that William K. Bush Brewing Company would cease operations. It had lasted 8 years. The family's own attempt to return to brewing on its own terms had ended, and the last Bush beer with a Bush on the letterhead of the brewer stopped rolling off the line. The second is Grant's Farm itself. In 2016, a public inheritance dispute broke out among Gussie Bush's 10 surviving children over the ownership and future of the farm. The dispute was covered in the St. Louis and national press. Trusts were named. Trustees were named. Beneficiaries were named. Legal filings were made and answered. It is the subject of a chapter in Billy Bush's 2023 memoir, Family Reigns, titled The Fight Over Grant's Farm. The farm remains, at the time of this account, in family and public trust structures. The chapter of its private ownership in 1 generation, the chapter Gussie held for nearly half a century, is closed. The book itself, published in 2023, is the source through which most of the family's own account of the 20th century curse pattern is now available on the public record. It is Billy Bush's own retelling of the family from Adolphus through his own generation, and it is, at time of writing, the most complete family testimony to the price of the dynasty. Chapter 16. What the Latin actually meant. The Latin over the door of the tomb on the highest hill was carved for the man who came, saw, and conquered, and the truth of the family it named is that the coming and the seeing and the conquering ended in the same room that began them. Return, for the last chapter, to the mausoleum on the highest ridge of Bellefontaine Cemetery in St. Louis. Return to the 2-foot blocks of granite. Return to the Gothic revival tomb designed by Thomas P. Barnett in the years after 1913. Return to the bronze door. Return to the 3 raised letters above it. Veni, vidi, vici. The words were true for Anheuser-Busch. He came from Castel in the Grand Duchy of Hesse. He saw a country in which a small German brewery could be turned, by pasteurization and refrigerated railcars and a bohemian recipe, into a national brand. He conquered it. He died in Germany in the year the American century began to break, and his widow brought his body home, and she built him the tomb, and she carved the words over the door as a claim on the future. The claim was that everything was settled. The claim was that the family had come and had seen and had conquered, and the account was closed. The account was not closed. The account, after Lily, opened again. It kept opening. The private paradise the fortune bought did not save the daughter on the road home from school in December of 1974. The private paradise the fortune bought did not save the father in the bedroom at Grant's farm in February of 1934. The private paradise the fortune bought did not save the young woman in the bed in Frontenac in December of 2010. The mansion did not save any of them. The zoo did not save any of them. The Clydesdale horses did not save any of them. The Latin over the door did not save any of them. The great old brand did not save any of them. The chair at the head of the company did not save any of them. The tomb on the highest hill did not save any of them. And the $52 billion in the summer of 2008 did not save the 6th Bush in that chair from being the last one in it. The fault line in the story is a family one. In 3 generations, the eldest son on the ladder took the company chair off the father above him. In May of 1975, August Bush III took the chair off his father Gussie, 5 months after Gussie had buried a child of 8. In July of 2008, August Bush III, from a seat as a director, argued the boardroom of Anheuser-Busch into a sale that ended the reign of his son August IV after 19 months. The son who had voted the father out had, in his own turn, voted the son out. The pattern was fiduciary. The pattern was procedural. The pattern was cold. The pattern was in the family. And on the day of the vote, in July of 2008, the 2 men stood together in a photograph. If you look at that photograph now, you can see them. A father at 71 and a son at 44. The father composed, the son composed. Between them a merger and an ending. And this is the beat at which the eerie register of the whole story settles, at last, into a plain sentence a person can say to another person and be believed. The Bush family did not lose the company. The Bush family voted for the ending. That is the reading the pattern arrives at. The last image belongs, as it should, to the tomb on the ridge. Bellefontaine Cemetery in St. Louis is quiet on most days of the year. The great trees stand along the alley. The Mississippi runs somewhere below the ridge. The visitor, walking up the long slope past the plots of the founding families of the American Middle West, comes at last to the tomb of Adolphus Busch. The bronze door is closed. The 3 raised Latin letters above it are the same letters the widow put there. Veni, vidi, vici. And if you stand for a moment in front of the door, in the middle of a weekday afternoon in the summer, in the light that falls through the great old oaks, and think about the German immigrant who came from Castel at 18, and about the son who shot himself in the bedroom at Grant's farm, and about the child on the road home from school, and about the son who voted the father out, and about the vote of the $52 billion, and about the young woman on the bed in Frontenac. The three Latin letters begin to read as they were carved, not as a boast, as an epitaph, as the last claim of a founder for a family whose story, over 150 years and 6 chief executives, would show what the claim actually cost. He came, he saw, he conquered. And the family that inherited the tomb spent the next century learning what that meant. If you want more stories like this one from the private side of the mansion, subscribe to Cursed Fortunes and stay for the ones already written into the schedule. Then, if you have made it to the end, I want to hear from you. Tell me where you are watching from, and tell me the moment in the Bush story you think the family stopped being able to save itself. Was it the pearl-handled revolver in the desk drawer, or the coup by the son in the boardroom, or the $70 a share in the summer of 2008?